Hello, and thank you for watching the Renewable Energy Academy online series, where we are recording a couple lectures that we have been presenting around the state. Mine is called Introduction to Renewables, and it's the first part of the series that I will speak more on in a little bit. My name is Ian O'Leary. I work for the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy Services Unit. So as I said, this is the first of a series of an online component for the Renewable Energy Academy workshops that over the last couple months in 2024, we have been taking around the state. These are in-person events where we deliver a couple hours of material about renewable energy, specifically planning and zoning for large systems, mostly under the topic of PA 233, which we will talk more about in a bit. Just a note is that anything presented today is subject to change if it becomes outdated later. We intend to issue some updates and some expansions of this material when we think it's necessary. But in general, this series, as it is three major parts. First is the introduction to renewables. Second is PA 233 in the four pathways, which my colleague Zona will present on. And finally is workable ordinances under PA 233, which will be presented by Madeline Kroll from the University of Michigan's Center for Empowering Communities. Another note I want to make is that there are many links within these slides that obviously won't work if you're just watching them, but we intend to post the PowerPoints as a separate function where you will be able to click on the links. If at any time you think this isn't working, just email any one of us and we'll get the slides right over to you or the links. So when I use the term Renewable Energy Academy, I am referring to a shared brand between a couple of organizations that are all approaching offering renewable energy planning and zoning technical assistance in a very similar way. This is EAGLE, University of Michigan Center for Empowering Communities, MSU Extension, Michigan Association of Planning, and Five Lakes Energy. This effort is supported by a recent DOE grant called RSTEP and is going to be further expanded by the EPA's climate pollution reduction grants. Taking this topic today is, as I said, myself, Ian O'Leary from EAGLE Energy Services. The Energy Services Unit is largely for grant administration and technical assistance, typically on topics such as energy efficiency, transportation, hydrogen, and for our team, utility scale renewable energy. This is a neutral office that doesn't have any particular say in the implementation or execution of PA 233. We're just here to collect information and distribute it and support whatever decisions come as a result. So as a quick primer, Public Act 233 of 2023 creates an option for utility scale renewable energy developers to ask the Michigan Public Service Commission, or the MPSC, to permit a grid-connected renewable energy project if an affected local unit of government, aka the zoning authority, does not have a CREO, or a compatible renewable energy ordinance. This option is not present until November 29th, 2024, which at the time of recording is quite near, and it only applies to three technologies of a certain size. For solar, it's 50 megawatts. For storage, it's 50 megawatts. And for wind energy, it's 100 megawatts. And these are referring to nameplate capacities. A couple other important rules about PA 233 are that a developer is not required to go to the MPSC. They may stay local, even if there is an incompatible ordinance in play, which the following lectures, particularly workability, will largely explore. Secondly, once at permitting, if we're talking about a permitting phase, then the renewable energy project already has a voluntary landowner host. Some lease or the potential of a lease is already signed. So this isn't talking about eminent domain in which the state is claiming land. A developer will only advance this MPSC certification option if they have a landowner partner. Finally, this one's a bit of a mouthful. A city or village is exempt from PA 233 if two things are in place. If the energy facility is located entirely within cities and villages, and if the city or village is now one of three things: the owner of the property, the developer of the energy facility, or the owner of the local utility that intends to take electricity from the development. If both of these conditions are met, then PA 233 doesn't apply. Another important thing that I want to cover on this topic is called the RRCA, or the Renewables Ready Communities Award, which is a pretty important part of the conversation about PA 233. This is a grant that EGLE administers, and its thinking was that developers must pay communities for state siting at $2,000 per megawatt, which may disincentivize communities from updating their own ordinances. In effect, this is kind of a lose-lose. The local government still loses zoning authority, and now the developer has to pay time and money to go through the state siting process. This appeared to be a hole in the system, which the RRCA is meant to support. So a grant from the state for local permitting balances that absence by effectively incentivizing ordinance updates and increasing the value statement for developers to stay local, because the state grant is covering the municipal incentive as opposed to themselves. This way, a local government would get money no matter what way the permitting played out. The RRCA provides up to $5,000 per megawatt to permitters and hosts of utility-scale renewable energy projects of the same size as PA 233, which underwent local permitting after October 2020. No deadline to apply and no immediate risk of depletion, largely due to the climate pollution reduction grants aforementioned. Now, getting into the actual basics, this is how renewable permitting through local pathways typically works. A developer gives a lease payment to a landowner, and the landowner therefore leases their land, typically step one. Then the developer seeks a permit from the zoning authority or the municipality. Once this is granted, the developer finances and builds the renewable power plant, which then pays taxes to the municipality, both industrial personal property and real property, of course, reduced through millage. And the developer ultimately profits in this arrangement despite fronting so many costs because of their ability to sell the electricity to local utilities, most cases in Michigan, consumers, DTE. Now, under PA 233, if the municipality's zoning is incompatible and a developer seeks this option, the developer can skip the municipal permit and instead seek a certificate from the MPSC, therefore subjecting the project to whatever the MPSC's standards are, which have recently been detailed. However, I'm not going to get too into the weeds here. The following two lectures are going to explore PA 233 much more closely. I'm just here to introduce the three technologies. So we are talking about a specific type of renewable energy called utility scale. Utility scale means it's large, it's the principal use on the land, and it's grid connected. So a lot of these other systems do not necessarily fall into the utility scale definition. Solar, as an example, if you're in doubt of whether something is utility scale, I would ask whether the project fits into one of these two categories. Is that project not grid connected? This means that whenever electricity goes to a specific location before or instead of the grid, it is out of scope for today's discussion. This is because it's not subject to PA 233 or eligible for the RRCA due to not being grid connected. This means any accessory uses like rooftop, homestead solar, like a small system in your backyard that supports your home's electrical consumption, parking lot hoods, etc. Another category that may exempt a solar project from this discussion is even if you're grid connected, any solar below 50 megawatts in nameplate capacity is not subject to PA 233 or eligible for the RRCA. And this is typically where community solar projects fall. So for wind in storage, it's a little bit more clear cut. more so for wind, less so for storage. But for solar, there's a lot of other types that aren't really involved in this conversation. We're mostly talking about the principal use large systems typically found on farmland. Both of these other types, accessory use or below 50 megawatts, still require local zoning ordinances. You should do a separate round of research for these type of systems that we are not going to be talking about today. There's plenty of resources, such as MSU and U of M's solar guidebook that explores accessory zoning, or SolSmart's accessory use guidebook. Plenty of resources are available to try to figure out how to make this type of solar work if you want it. But today we're talking about the bigger uses. So what exactly does grid connection mean? Just as a small introduction, electricity goes to the grid. The grid is the full eastern half of the United States. Then the utilities, such as DTE and consumers, buy that electricity from developers and their power plants and distribute it through their lines to customers. You should imagine customers as, or you should imagine the grid as a bucket of water where the customers are drinking from it with a straw, as you can see at the bottom of this figure. So this means a couple things. You can't pick what you drink. Clean electricity is just the same as coal-generated electricity. It's all electrons being poured into the same bucket, and there's no ability to distinguish between what you consume. As a result, any cost or reliability impacts of any given generator affects the whole grid. The whole bucket of water is impacted by any changes to the bucket. This means that if the fuel cost of coal goes significantly up, then the entire grid is affected as a result, even those who may be closer located to renewable projects. Similarly, the intermittency of wind and solar, its variability and its uncertainty, can also have impacts that affect the entire grid, not just the local hosts. And finally, due to the renewable portfolio standard, a fixed amount of renewables will be built regardless of who hosts them. The discussion of whether this is a policy that should be in play or whether it should be challenged or reduced is also beyond the scope of today's conversation. But as it is, a certain amount of renewables are legally required of the utilities to be supplied or to composite the supply to customers. So we should expect a similar grid makeup in a couple of years, regardless of which communities do or don't host renewables. I think that's pretty important for local decision making and limits the scope to the type of things that you can impact as a local community through local zoning and through expression of preferences through community engagement. So let's look at where we're currently at. On the left is a map of the existing utility scale renewable energy projects in Michigan. Yellow is solar, gray is wind. And this is of a certain year, which I'm not recalling. But collecting some of the data here, let's take this table one row at a time. So looking at solar, we have the average megawatts of an existing project being 17, the total megawatts of everything existing being about 1,000. And then in the MISO queue, which is essentially a line that projects have to get in until they get built, which is really hypothetical, really optimistic, and is just meant to demonstrate industry interest. You can see that the average megawatt of a proposed project is going from 17 to about 160. And the total megawatts proposed are up to 20,000 megawatts waiting in the queue to potentially be deployed in Michigan. Then if you look down at wind, you can see the numbers in the proposed queue are much less, though we do have more megawatts currently existing. And then scrolling down further to battery energy storage systems, which is the main kind of storage we'll be discussing, we have almost none in Michigan, but a ton proposed. 14,000 megawatts in the queue with an average size of 150 megawatts per project. Again, these are hypothetical numbers. Definitely don't cite these as hard expectations, but it should give you an idea of the trend for the state and what kind of things are being looked at. For comparison, Michigan is the 33rd state in the US for percentage of renewables deployed. And our energy is currently 15% provided for by renewable energy, whereas the top states in the country are around 46 to 60%. The only point here being that we're the lower middle sort of the pack, just to give you context for how many renewables might be getting asked for in other states by comparison. So why is there so much activity towards renewables? I'm sure a lot of you have heard plenty of discussion about why renewables are becoming more and more attractive to the industry. But even prior to new legislation, electricity purchasers, which are the utilities, were calling for a 4 times increase in renewable deployment. And this new legislation is referring to A233 and the new Renewable Portfolio Standards expansion. The reason that this increase has been called for is due to efficiency improvements in the technology, cost reductions in the technology, and a general trend towards decreasing the fuel dependency of coal and natural gas, which is becoming more uncertain and more expensive. A lot of these efficiency and cost improvements have been rapidly expanding over the last couple of years. As such, consumers in DTE in their 2021 and 2022 integrated resource plans, which is essentially their looks towards the future of what they want to build out, even a couple years ago, far prior to any of the new legislation, consumers was calling for up to 80K acres and DTE for up to 60K acres of renewable energy within about 20 years. This is using the really conservative rule of thumb estimate of 10 acres per megawatt, which is a lot higher than you see for some projects, but that's just to give us the best understanding of that proposition. Another major question about renewables is its context nationally. So on the left here, we have solar potential throughout the country, and on the right, we have wind. Wind, we can make a pretty clear statement that Michigan has competitive resource, but solar is often an eyebrow is raised at that because Michigan is not the sunniest place, as we know, whereas there are places in the country that have very, very high solar irradiance. But there's 2 major points that need to be made about this. First, there are sunnier and windier places than Michigan. Still, Michigan renewables are effective enough to continue attracting developers and willing utility customers. This is the thing we really need to remember. Even if there is an argument that solar being deployed in Michigan is less efficient than it being deployed elsewhere, developers are willing to take that risk. They believe that it is cost effective enough, and so proposals are happening regardless. And then the second point is that this scale is a little bit skewed. As you can see, the palest portion here is about 4 kilowatts per meter squared per day, whereas the darkest version is about 6-ish. So a solar panel in Michigan still produces about 70% of the energy as it would in Arizona. So there is a significant relative difference between the places, but it's not as if Michigan is not in space. It is definitely available for renewable deployment from a resource potential perspective. Regardless, even with those 2 points made, I don't believe that these national maps are good enough for local decision making. If you're just looking at Michigan, it simply looks like it's all the same and every square foot of area is equivalent. So we've made an in-house model over an energy services unit that takes in a couple more Michigan-specific factors into its tabulation, and I'll show you just what those are in a second. We can do solar or wind suitability of pretty much anywhere in the state, with red being less suitable areas for these examples, and green being more suitable. There should be a self-service map of some sort available in the future for this item, but if not, you can feel free to email any of us at the Renewable Energy Academy team, and we can try to process a map for your area if you would like to take a closer look. These maps also have substations placed on them, which are a really major part of this conversation. So looking at this model a little bit more, we took these 4 factors into account: slope of the land, distance to substations, and population density, and finally, land use type. we made a couple changes to the land use table. For example, more national resource potential analyses say that forest can be a partially suitable land for solar. Just for our purposes of emphasizing how much solar likes to be on already cleared farmland and trying to reduce the uh, balancing the scales around forest or other more unrealistic land uses, we tweaked these values to really only call out a couple major categories like hay and pasture and cultivated crops and herbaceous environments, just because this is typically where we see solar going in Michigan. We took all those values and gave them different weights to say how important they were. We increased the weight of land use type. And another notable change we made is that we removed solar potential. So this is just referring to the strength of sunlight. When this was in, it would kind of smear the whole map to be a similar color. But since Michigan has very consistent solar potential across the state, removing this entirely allowed the more meaningful differences like substations and land use type to really pop out of them. So there's a summary of what we did and an example of how it generally corresponds to Michigan. Now I'm going to cover some of the generic benefits from renewables at large before we move into more specific technologies. Tax revenue is available for all of the hosting technologies through the form of industrial personal property tax. For wind, if we assume a 30-year lifespan, it's about $15,000 a year per turbine. And the number of turbines that a given municipality hosts in a full project differs. And another important point is that this tax table changes over time, or is at least subject to change. However, for solar, there's a structure called the payment in lieu of taxes that skips the tax table and instead guarantees up to $7,000 per megawatt annually as it says, payment in lieu of tax. For either of these payments, as you well know, if you represent a municipality, this value doesn't all reach the township level. One non-PILT solar example that we cite is a solar project generating $419,000 total dollars in tax revenue, but ultimately only $31,000 of that went to the hosting township. So you do have to keep your millages in mind when thinking about how much value you'll get from these projects as a permitting host. Another revenue is the Renewables Ready Communities Award, or the RRCA. Again, that EAGLE grant that pays for local permits, not the state route, and locally hosting for $2,500 to $5,000 per megawatt. It's done whether you do both of those functions or just one. Another is the Community Benefits Agreement. This is an optional sum paid by a developer for the host's betterment. These are not guaranteed and are usually the result of mutually beneficial conversation between the municipality and the developer. But notably, if state siting is pursued, then a community benefits agreement is required at about $2,000 per megawatt. And this is kind of what the RRCA is meant to balance and counteroffer. The revenue to landowners is pretty high in most cases, so it's important to understand this. For leasing or land purchasing, it differs for wind and solar. For wind, on average, rental payments for the placement of a single wind turbine lease can pay up to $8,000 per year. This is from 2017, so it might be a bit outdated. For solar, under agreements with private solar developers, farmers can earn rental payments varying from $500 to $2,000 per acre per year. Kind of a rule of thumb would more so be like $1,000 to $1,500. So this is important to understand the type of value that's being offered to landowners in exchange for their leasing. And additionally, neighbor payments may be arranged in which a non-participating neighbor or one who doesn't host the technology still gets a share of the revenue if they're within proximity. These are pretty common for wind, and upcoming research by University of Michigan will show how prevalent it is for solar. But it's important to note that these are not guaranteed. And similar to the community benefits agreement would be the subject of a further conversation between the municipality and the developer. So next, I'm going to rapidly introduce the three technologies, and I want to make a couple caveats just so you can understand the scope of this relatively short presentation. So I want to introduce common zoning items, but I'm not going to be providing hard data on how often we see that thing really happening or describing what the many zoning options are for each item. That's because a future update to our Renewable Energy Academy materials will go way more in detail on providing data for these items, and because the rest of this series, the 2 lectures after this, will explore some of the zoning options that are at play for each of them. I'm just here to briefly touch on what each technology is. Secondly, the cons covered here are just the ones that are typically responded to with zoning. This isn't meant to be a comprehensive list, but more so an overview of what we often see responded to with zoning. So let's introduce solar first. You've seen most of this table with a new cell, which is the rough average acres per megawatt. For solar, there's a conservative 10 acres per megawatt, though you often see a much lower acre per megawatt, more efficient systems showing up in Michigan. But just to be safe, we're going to multiply these megawatt values by that acreage factor. Average megawatt existing is 170 acres. Total existing is about 10,000 acres. Average size of a proposed project in the queue is 1,600 acres. So they're getting much bigger. Solar in general, a couple of rules is that it likes flat, cleared land that can use generic designs. Developers don't really want to have to design a new like ballast or racking system just for specific land's characteristics, nor do they want to clear the land if it can be avoided. So the obvious candidate here is farmland. Secondly, economy of scale is critical. Small patches of solar cost the developer more per megawatt than if it was bigger. This is because they can roll out all of their construction and all of their project management all at once. So developers will generally trend towards bigger is better. This means that smarter sites such as brownfields, landfills, etc., could be cost ineffective for developers when they could scale up. And finally, for solar, if you're considering a solar project or being approached for one, you should visit one and be able to see it and hear it and experience what it's like to be in that vicinity. One example that we put here that gives some nice parcel level context where you can really see some farmland and some residential parcels is Assembly Solar in Shiawassee County in Michigan. This is a 1,200 acre project at 350 megawatts, and it's currently the largest in Michigan. Now, to briefly summarize the benefits and concerns, as I mentioned, for solar, first, for the benefits, we have revenues to municipality and landowners, as previously discussed. Another benefit is that solar could be argued to contribute to a domestic energy system by virtue of reducing the dependency on fuel imports. Additionally, there are some federal incentives to developers to receive tax credits in return of steel, iron, and other manufacturing sources being supplied domestically. Another local benefit is low emissions. This can have 2 different outcomes. This can affect 2 different things. One is sustainability goals, if your community values that, and one is a lack of localized air pollution relative to other generators like coal, natural gas. Another upside to solar is its opportunity for mixed use. This is referring to agrivoltaics, or growing crops between or under panels, grazing, which would be livestock grazing between panels, or pollinator cover, which is the most common example, which is local wildflowers that are conducive to pollinator habitat being planted between the panels to use that space efficiently. Another benefit is the opportunity for smart sites for solar. As I mentioned, this is referring to land that is already marginal or not being used for anything necessarily productive. This could be a Superfund site, a brownfield, a landfill, the space over parking lots. Solar can modularly deploy into these spaces, which is definitely a positive. Finally, there's jobs. with a caveat, there's two very different types of jobs when it comes to renewable energy. There's the large number of immediate construction jobs, but those are not long-term. The operation and maintenance jobs that do stay about long-term, for the assembly solar example that we just mentioned, that was about 4 to 6 long-term jobs after the fact. Now, to go through the concerns, again, not covering data or zoning options, but mostly just putting these on your radar. For solar, their visual impacts typically responded to with screening, but that screening can be unsatisfactory or too slow in some cases. Another concern is property values. I did collect a quick sentence of data here just to put it on the record. Recent research has shown that homes within 0.5 miles experience an average home price reduction of 1.5%. Just says something to take away. Another concern is sound. So the inverters, which are usually like kind of scattered in the center of the parks, these sound like a fridge from the park edge, just to give you an idea of the level of noise here. Another local concern is wildlife migration interruption. These fenced-in areas may be disturbing what were prior wildlife migration paths. Again, another item that can be responded to in zoning, which we will describe later. Another concern is land use and farmland preservation. This is typically addressed in zoning through districting, or in the past, there's been lot maximums or acreage limits, etc. But there's a lot of conversation to have about this item for sure. Another very important one is end of life and decommissioning. The question of who will pay to remove and restore and recycle these technologies, a huge question in zoning, which will be discussed in the future. And finally, a concern is grid impacts. Even though the RPS is saying that a flat amount will affect our grid anyways, it could still be a local concern of renewables and their effect on reliability and how their bills will respond in turn, which is something that we hope to cover again in the future, more in-depth version. Now let's move on to wind. So I'm using a rough average acre of 0.5 per megawatt. I'll describe where that number comes from in just a second. Applying that to the megawatt values we see, we get 46 acres existing. The total megawatts, or the total acres existing, is about 2,000. And the average size of a proposed project is about 98 acres. You may think these seem a little small, but that's because of where the 0.5 came from. So there's an actual versus total footprint to think about for wind. Actual is referring to the physical size of the turbine in the cleared space immediately around it and the access roads to get to the turbine. This is only about 0.5 acres per megawatt. The rest of that space can still and is almost always used for farming. The other way to think about the size of wind is the total footprint, or the full visual spread, from the furthest turbine on one perimeter to the furthest turbine on another perimeter. How much space is actually happening there? How much total horizon is taken up by the wind? That's a valid different measurement, but not the one that I am tabulating in this 0.5 megawatts. When we're talking about the height of wind turbines, there's two different categories: hub height, which is like the nose between the blades, and tip height, which is referring to the maximum height of the blades when they're extended upright. Whenever you're hearing a wind turbine height described, it's almost always going to be hub height, just as a rule of thumb. The average hub height in the US is about 340 feet, which is roughly the size of the Statue of Liberty, a little bit bigger. It's important to note that that's a somewhat outdated height for average, and over the recent years, the heights of turbines has been trending upwards, and proposed projects are continuing that trend and wanting to get bigger, stronger turbines, which generate a lot more electricity. Though it is worth mentioning that there may be a logistic plateau at some point in which the turbines can't get bigger because they can't be transported and maintained easily at a certain point. In general, though, taller turbines equals fewer turbines. There's two reasons for this. One is that turbines are required to be spaced apart from one another based on the diameter of their blades. So if you're taller, you have bigger blades and therefore a bigger diameter, and therefore the turbines have to get spaced further away. This also, because the blades are bigger, they generate way more power. So you can get the same megawatts of a wind project with fewer turbines if they're taller. So this brings up a local decision-making question of, would I rather have the vertical view shed impacted, or would I rather have the horizontal view shed impacted? Because fewer turbines on the horizon, if they're, 100 feet taller or so, may be a worthy trade-off in your mind. Here's an example again at the parcel level. The blue circles refer to placed turbines and their spacing between one another. You can see there are 4 turbines in this one township. These belong to the Meridian Wind Project, which in total is 77 turbines. In total footprint, it's 1,200 acres and contributes to 225 megawatts. So this gives you an example of what one township may see when they are a part of a larger utility scale wind project. Again, similar to solar, if you are being approached for one or are interested in one, you should visit one. Covering benefits and concerns, the benefits are similar to solar from the revenue perspective. However, since it doesn't replace the actual farming operation, the landowner revenue can be a significant boost to farming operations. This means that the sales pitch, as it is to landowners, can be pretty strong. However, the higher view shed means that more neighbors are impacted by a decision to host wind. So it can have a very different type of conversation or a different level of frequency compared to solar. Additionally, there's more likely neighbor agreements in place with wind. This also contributes to a domestic energy system, which, if you recall, is referring to a reduction of fuel imports, as well as an increased federal emphasis on domestic sourcing. Generally, because wind is much more effective in Michigan than solar relative to other states, it's a very good player in the energy system. Wind also has low emissions, which can contribute to sustainability goals or a lack of localized air pollution. And it also has the same caveats about jobs, construction versus operation, short-term versus long-term. Now, looking at the concerns, the ones that are typically responded to with zoning for wind are visual impacts, which there's many different categories for wind. There's the actual sightline itself, there's the red light at night, and there's shadow flicker, which is the effect of the blades on windows. All 3 of these items are traditionally responded to with zoning in some way, shape, or form. Red lights in particular are, it's industry standard at this point to have an aircraft detection lighting system that turns off at night unless there are planes approaching. So there are a lot of industry standard best practices for these. But we'll explore those more in future lectures. Property values for wind, another quick statement of data is that there's an 11% decline of home value within 1 mile of a wind project. However, this recovers after 2 years. Homes greater than 2 miles away are unaffected. This is also recent and highly anticipated research, which I will be able to source and explore a little bit more in the future. The sound of wind, still using a fridge as a unit, it sounds like a fridge rather than from the park edge with solar from about 4 football fields away. So there's a distant ambient noise. Generally speaking, this blends with road noise. It's not much larger than cars, but this is a significant conversation of zoning and local preference. Additionally, there are wildlife impacts, this time mostly from migrating birds, birds of prey, bats. Another item that can be just a study into this can be required through your ordinance. Health and safety for wind has a couple categories. There's risk of fire, there's risk of ice throw, which is when ice collects on the blades and then gets flung when it starts spinning, or turbine collapse. End of life and decommissioning is, of course, relevant for wind just as well as it is for solar and storage. And finally, the same grid impacts from solar are in play here. The variability and uncertainty of wind mean that there could be effects on the grid's reliability, hypothetically, as well as maybe effects on bills. Not saying whether this is the case or not, but that it may be a local concern is definitely valid. Now, moving on to storage. These are really small systems, as you can see from the picture. This is 137 megawatts of battery energy storage, which is a much smaller footprint than you would see for 137 megawatts of solar or wind. In general, it's 0.1 acres per megawatt. So applying that to our other values, the average size of proposed is 15 acres, and the average size or the total size proposed is 1,400 acres to get us that 14,000 megawatts, which is proposed in the queue, again, hypothetical. When we're talking about storage in these contexts, it's almost always referring to lithium-ion batteries. There are many other kinds of storage, such as our own Ludington pumped storage in Michigan, but those other storage technologies are a little bit less urgent, in my opinion. Lithium-ion batteries are definitely the ones being proposed most frequently, in that a lot of conversation about PA 233 zoning for batteries may surround. One thing about storage is that it has very versatile siting. Since it's these little kind of shipping containers, they're very small, they're very modular. You can slot in multiple different storage containers at different right-of-ways if it's available, that can really increase the megawatt per acre efficiency of renewable energy. And worth noting is that there's practically none of these in Michigan, which means that the planning and zoning for it is there's not a lot of precedent to go off of, and a lot to figure out for these conversations. It is worth mentioning that University of Michigan just published a battery zoning guidebook to complement the existing wind and solar planning and zoning guidebooks. So definitely check that out. It will be linked at the end as well. Quickly summarizing the benefits and concerns for batteries now. There are revenues, just as mentioned for wind and solar. As I said, there's a small footprint for these systems, so there's more revenue dollars per acre utilized. And they also have a great opportunity for co-siting. If there's existing right-of-ways for wind, solar, and anything else, you may be able to slot in storage pretty easily to increase revenue without taking up much more additional land. Same job statement as usual. But this time, as opposed to being a concern, the effect of battery storage on the grid is distinctly positive. Storage fills many of the gaps of renewables. It allows wind blowing more strongly at night and sun obviously being more effective during the day to kind of smooth out into a more stable profile. It's very important for the topic of a renewably supported grid. The concerns, there's visual impacts, of course. Similar to solar, it could be responded to with screening most traditionally. For sound, it's louder than solar because it has cooling functions involved, whereas solar is just an inverter. And it's persistent. The sound continues even at night, which doesn't happen for solar. However, the systems are smaller in general, so their overall, shed of their sound should be relatively smaller. Environmental impacts are referring to leakage or any kind of abrasive effect of chemicals on the nearby area. Research finds that there's no passive impacts. They don't just happen as time passes. Mostly these come into question when incidents occur, which brings us to incidents, the fire and explosion risk of batteries. I'll summarize this more in the future, but for now, it's safe to summarize incidents as being relatively rare and recently much more safe. Emergency response for these systems has matured greatly, and as a result, a general good rule of thumb is that local fire departments should engage in special training for these systems. Although the risk of an incident is rare, it should definitely be prepared for in a slightly different fashion than normal technology. Finally, there's little siting and zoning precedent for these systems, which mostly ties into the increased emphasis on end of life and decommissioning for battery storage, which alongside all of these other items will be described as we dive into PA233 later and what comprises the CREO, what comprises the MPSC's best practices, and much more. So in summary, my name was Ian O'Leary. These are the email addresses for the three of us on the Renewable Energy Academy team at Eagle. We are also the grant administrators for the Renewables Ready Communities Awards, so please feel free to ask any of us with any questions on this topic. I have a collected list of resources here, which again, I know you can't click the screen, but this should be attached to a slide deck elsewhere, or you can email us or Google any of these terms. Above the bar are any resources related to PA233, and below the bar are any more general utility scale renewable energy resources in the space, such as the 3 zoning guidebooks as I described before. Thank you very much for watching.